So let's go to our top main story today. Since Nigeria's independence in 1960, the Buhari's administration holds the record of being the most supportive of the subnationals or state governments in terms of financial bailouts. In the past 6 years, the financial position of nearly all the state governments in Nigeria had worsened, resulting in the ballooning of their debts from both local and foreign sources. Let me give you a snapshot. Look at the numbers. I'm going to bring it out right now. If you look at the foreign debt as at June last year, in all foreign debts by all the 36 states and the Federation, according to the DMO, was $4.263 billion US dollars. The local debt size of it is about 4.263 trillion naira, and that's as of December last year. So look at the numbers there by yourself. Now, if you look at the local debts, as of 2016, that figure, but bring it back, folks, that figure was standing at about 658 billion. But look at December 2020. That frog figure had moved from 658 billion to 4.26 trillion naira in local debts. And this information I'm showing you, according to DMO, based on the figures submitted by state governments and FCT on their own to the DMO. So that's most likely not the total figure. But let's talk about a big daddy bailout, which is the Buhari's administration. Yeah, that's a ballooning, by the way. Give me a big daddy bailout, by the way. So there's got a big daddy, the Buhari's administration, just a few months after President Buhari was sworn in, the state government requested for bailout, and he gave them 2.1 billion US dollar. And where did that money come from? Nigeria's dividend from the Nigerian liquefied natural gas. Remember the hullabaloo that followed that $2.1 billion? Yes, it was shared among the 36 states and the FCT. Then in May 2016, just at the middle of the pandemic, another $5 billion was shared among the 36 states of the Federation. That, as at that time, was about 1 trillion naira. Exchange rate, by the way, had since gone through the roof. So how was this money shared in May 2016? Yes, 689 billion was the bailout. 310 billion naira was given the state governments by President Buhari's administration as loans via the excess crude account. That's where this 5 billion came from. Now, 36 states got the salary bailout. 35 states applied for the ECA loan, excess crude account loan. Moving to the next page. In September 2019, now you find the state governments were begging for bailout, refund, deferral. What happened, remember, was that the government deducted 112 billion to the Ministry of Finance from their FAC allocations. Then they cried to Big Daddy, President Buhari himself, and said, please stop the deductions. So the states are still owing about 260 billion as of September 2019. Then August last year, the states came forward again through the Governors Forum and asked President Buhari for another bailout. This time around, what they want to use the money for? Insecurity. They say there's so much problem, insecurity across states. They want money from the excess crude account. Well, we didn't hear whether President Buhari actually ceded to that. Now, the central bank had also, over the last 6 years, or 4 years to be more precise, helped these 36 states to restructure their bank loans with the various commercial banks. That's where we are tonight. Joining me to discuss this is Johnson Chukwu, the CEO at Carrier Asset Management. Welcome to the show. This is a two-part conversation. Johnson, I just showed you the numbers from the big daddy to the banks to the market. Then all these numbers, I'm sure you know, Johnson, does not include the funds that these state governments have on the stock market in terms of bonds. So what, in your opinion, is the whole essence of debt sustainability by the state governments?
Thank you, Jose, for having me. The concept of debt sustainability is that a borrower should limit the level of borrowing and level of debt to the extent that he or the institution can be able to pay. Where you do not have a limit to the amount you are borrowing, you are going to get to a point where you have a debt overhang. So you are no longer in a position to honor your debt obligations. Which are the concerns? Which are the reasons why you had a Fiscal Responsibility Act? Which are the reasons why there are limits to which even a federation, a national government can borrow from itself? from its own central bank. But the challenge we have had in the past is that because there are no conditionalities to the bailout that the federal government has granted to the states, there are no conditions that the states have to meet before they access any of these credit lines or any of this supportive funding. What has happened is they have not been able to subject themselves to some level of discipline that you require when you have financial difficulties. Because before you allow the restructuring, like the restructuring that was done when the government came into power, where they made the central bank to take on, or the DMO, the Debt Management Office, to take on the debt, the commercial loans of the states. What the state did immediately is to go back into a borrowing binge, because you just granted them the leave without conditionalities. The challenge we have is that for you to grant any debt forbearance or any debt restructuring, there must be conditions that you impose on that borrower so that they will not go back to that conditions which are dealt by them out from.
Based on some of what was shown on the screen and on the wall, what pattern of debt accumulation have you seen in particular since the advent of democratic governance in 1919, Johnson, among the state governments?
What we've seen is consistently the states go to the commercial banks, because the commercial banks granted them loans with no conditions, and because the state assemblies have become appendages of the executive arm of government. So what they do is that they get the state House of Assembly to approve for them to access lending from the commercial banks, and they now rely that they're going to rely on the FAC allocations for payment of these debts. So when economic conditions changed and the FAC allocations declined, the state found themselves struggling to meet debt obligations. The borrowing from structured lenders like the capital markets has been quite few and far apart, because the conditionalities include that you must have a pre-qualified list of projects you want to execute with those funds, and SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, will monitor the execution of those projects, and you have to render quarterly returns on the extent you've gone to apply these funds. So because of those structural conditions, including the limit of what you can access from the capital market vis-a-vis your unencumbered revenue, the state government, many of them do not go to the capital market, and they feel that when they are the ones that have the right structures, because you have to have your rated accounts, you have your accounts, you have to be rated by a rating agency, you have to rate the bond and rate the state finances. These are not conditions that many states are ready to subject themselves to. So they easily go to the commercial banks who have no conditionalities and access as much as they can. And in a lot of instances, the commercial banks, because they are making good money from these states, do not impose any conditions on them, and do not even set limits to the amount they can lend to the states.
Okay, now we're going to continue this conversation after the break, Johnson. But very quickly, we just showed some numbers, and I'm sure you were watching on your TV screen, the level of bailouts and the loans in the last 5-6 years. Are you scared by these numbers that you look at? Look at 2016. The local debts were just 658 billion among the 36 states. By December last year, that figure was 4.263 trillion naira.
You know why it's actually alarming, Bosin, is because, like I said, there are no limitations to constraints imposed on the states to access funding.
I got a question to add to what you just said. When we come back, Johnson, stand by. There's a lot more. In April last year, state governors asked the Central Bank of Nigeria to suspend all fund deductions from state governments and restructure their debt repayments to help safeguard their liquidity and mitigate the economic impact of COVID-19 pandemic. But way back in June of 2016, the Africa Research Institute published a report stating that President Buhari may have had the best intentions, but approving bailouts without demanding greater transparency, accountability, and responsibility from state governments was not a long-term solution. Let's chat to the rules of fiscal responsibility that state governments should adhere. Johnson Chukwu of Carrier Asset Management is still with us on the show. Johnson, let's continue this conversation about where we finished up. I'm sure you listened to that statement. Way back in 2016, yes. Transparency, accountability, and fiscal responsibility.
Most indeed, we're not the only ones that said that. I remember saying similar things, maybe not using the same words. And I also remember the likes of Mr. P2B, former governor of Anambra State, said like that if you grant debt forgiveness or bailout to state government, that is similar to going to pay for the bill of a drunkard, and then without imposing on the drunkard the limit of his drinking, and then immediately the drunkard will go back to the bar, drink again, and you go and pay. And this is exactly what we're seeing. Because the federal government has bailing out the states without any conditions, without stipulating some minimum standard of behavior from those state governments. So what you see is that the state governments go back and they keep accumulating debt, knowing fully well that Father Christmas is hanging out by the corner and we bail them out. All the bailout we've seen so far have no conditions attached to them. And if you go back to the books of those states, many of them are actually carrying debt that are not shown in their books because they've now learnt the skill of using SPVs, special purpose vehicles, to borrow instead of having it on their balance sheet. And then also issue ISPO, that is the Irrevocable Starting Payment Order, to these special vehicles. So you have the revenues of the state committed for donkey years to come. In many instances, these borrowings are not tied to fiscal infrastructure. So they are not going to generate revenue from which they can be paid back. And those are the concerns you have. So we need to go back and review the Fiscal Responsibility Act and drill it down, yes, or cascade it down to the states.
Yes, we'll do that. But again, one key question, is politics a key factor to rising debt at state government levels or subnationals in Nigeria? Do you think politics play a key role?
Well, the way I would look at it, I would say that the weaknesses of our current political structure are contributory, because the key thing is that you look at the three arms of government, they are supposed to the legislature is supposed to be a check and balance to the executive. But if the legislature has been effectively at the state level fused into the executive arm of government, so you realize that there is no checks and balance. There are no checks and balances, and therefore the executive arm of government does whatever they like. And where those actions of theirs are not to the best interest of the society, there's nobody to check them. That's what I would say. Politics has actually not served us well the way it's intended to serve us. But in terms of political system, we could say the political system, the way we are running our democratic system, has impinged on the checks and balances that should be built into a democratic system of our nature, a federal system of government. And for that reason, the state governments have no restriction. They have open check to use economic resources of the state as they so please. So what you will at best pray for is you have a responsible executive who is ready to check himself or herself, instead of hoping that the current structures of governance will check those government executive arms of government.
Now, when you talk about the fiscal responsibility, what needs to change?
In the first place, if you look at our current Fiscal Responsibility Act, it stipulates that the federal government deficit should not be more than 3% of GDP. But if you look at the GDP is not a productive GDP like you have in Western countries, where the government revenue is tied to the GDP, or there is a link, or there is a direct link between the size of the GDP and the government revenue. The government revenue in the case of Nigeria is tied to fossil fuel. So we need to review our Fiscal Responsibility Act and make it to be tied to the government revenue and not the budget. So if, for instance, you say, look, the government deficit should not be more than 5 or 10% of its revenue, it becomes contingent on the government to make sure that either they grow the revenue or they keep their costs low. But the structure we have today is why we're having consistent borrowing by ways and means from at the federal level, and at the state level, the state governments keep going to the commercial banks and issuing ISPO either directly to the commercial banks, but because ISPO now requires the Minister of Finance and the DMO to sign off, they now have a structure to create SPVs where they issue the ISPO and they circumvent some of the requirements of borrowing from the capital market.
So when we talk about the serial bailouts that the federal government has provided and all of that, whether to the central bank or monies that came to the excess crude account and what have you. Now, do you think the capital markets can be of help in resolving these debt burdens at the state level?
Well, as you know, the debts that the state government took from the commercial banks were transferred to the DMO. The debt they took from the capital markets were not transferred. They are still servicing those debts because borrowing from the capital market imposes some limits to the behavior of the borrower because they are the prospectus will specify the purpose of the loan, like I said earlier, and then the deployment or utilization of those funds must be regularly audited and the returns rendered to SEC. Again, if you want to change the use of those funds, you need to go back to the bond holders, which is a complex issue. So there are some discipline that are imposed on borrowers by the capital market. If we had eliminated or reduced the amount that the state government can borrow from commercial banks and insist that they must borrow from structured lending institutions like the capital market, we will probably reduce the level of recklessness that we have seen in the deployment of these funds and the amount of money that had been borrowed by the state government.
How do you think subnational state governments' debt levels can be reduced or deleveraged? Can they be forced to sell assets? Pay back?
Well, in many instances, the state government do not even have access to sell, or do not have. And to sell assets, you need to go to the House of Assembly. Like I said, the House of Assemblies of the states are appendages of the executive, and then you may need to even get the opinion of the citizens of that state. What we need to do is put a cap on the expenditure of a state government vis-a-vis their revenue, so that state government will have the compelling need to go and expand their revenue sources or keep a tap or a cap on their expenditure. That way, if you do that, over time, the state government are going to grow their revenues to the point that they can comfortably carry their current debts. And like I also said, we need to index the amount any government arm can borrow to its revenue.
All right, well, thank you for your insights this evening on this debt sustainability at subnational level. Johnson Chukwu, have a great evening.